Picture it, a bitter winter night in January 1457, the winds of Wales lashing against the stone ramparts of Pembroke Castle. Inside, within a chamber thick with the smoke of burning herbs, a girl's scream slices through the gloom. 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort clutches at the bloodied sheets beneath her frail body, her face pale and sweat-drenched. Each cry rattles the walls as if the ancient fortress itself shudders with her. The midwives murmur prayers in Latin, crossing themselves, their hands trembling as they prepare knives, hooks, and herbs, tools not only of birth but of death, for they know how many young mothers perish on beds, just like this one. The flicker of candles throws monstrous shadows across the chamber. The girl is a child, not yet grown into her own body, yet she has been commanded by dynastic ambition to perform a woman's task that threatens to tear her apart. Outside, the sea crashes endlessly against the Welsh cliffs, but inside the only sound is pain, the ripping agony of a girl forced to bring forth an heir before her hips had even finished forming. Those attending her whisper of saints and miracles, of Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patroness of childbirth. They pray because the facts are cruel. Her pelvis is narrow, the infant large, its position awkward. The physician, Dr. Lewis Caerleon, has already confided his fears to Jasper Tudor, Margaret's brother-in-law, pacing outside. He knows the odds. Both mother and child may not survive the night. Hours pass. Margaret writhes, her screams becoming hoarse gasps. The midwives press cloths soaked in rosemary to her lips, murmur encouragement, and shift her frail body into positions that might coax the child into the world. The ordeal stretches into 18 hours, an eternity measured in blood and sweat. Some midwives prepare for the worst, laying out relics on the table. A fragment of bone said to be from a saint, a vial of holy water. They know that if the girl dies, her soul must be rushed to heaven. Then, at last, the silence breaks. A cry, thin and angry, pierces the chamber. The newborn is alive. The midwives lift the blood-slicked infant to the firelight, their faces awash with relief and awe. They press him briefly to his mother's chest. Margaret, barely conscious, forces her eyes open. She sees him, her son, Henry Tudor, the boy who will one day rise from this fragile, improbable beginning to claim the crown of England. But this miracle carries its price. Margaret's body is broken beyond repair. The damage from this single birth leaves her unable to bear more children. At 13, she has given England its future king, but has lost forever her chance at normal motherhood. She drifts into fever, half in this world and half in another, clinging to survival. Few in that chamber grasp the weight of what has happened. The wars of the roses rage beyond these castle walls. Lancaster against York, red rose against white, and yet within this girl's agony lies the seed of a dynasty that will end that bloodshed. For now, though, there is only exhaustion. The child is wrapped in swaddling, the girl lies pale as parchment, and the midwives exchange wary glances. They know they have witnessed something history will not forget. The night a child bore a child who would one day bear the crown. The Atlantic wind howls through the cracks of Pembroke's stones, carrying with it the echoes of Margaret's screams. They linger like a curse and a prophecy, entwined. England has its Tudor heir, but at the cost of a girl's innocence, her body shattered before her life had even begun. The girl lying in that chamber was no ordinary child bride, no forgotten noble tucked away in obscurity. Margaret Beaufort carried in her veins the fire and poison of royal blood. Through her father, John Beaufort, she was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, the mighty Duke of Lancaster and fourth son of Edward III. That made her kin to kings, distant but undeniable. Yet in 15th century England, such a bloodline was never a shield. It was a mark that drew both fortune and peril. To possess a trace of the crown was to live as both prize and target. For Margaret, that inheritance was a double-edged blade. In an age when the Wars of the Roses were about to explode, Lancaster against York, any child of noble lineage was a piece on a bloody chessboard. From birth, she was destined to be moved by others' hands, her body and her future sacrificed for alliances. To the world, her value lay not in her person, but in her blood. Her story began decades earlier with the rise and fall of her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. A man of pride and high ambition, He had once carried England's banners across France during the waning years of the Hundred Years' War. Yet those banners became shrouds. His campaigns ended in disaster. The glories won by Henry V, the triumph at Agincourt, the dream of an English kingdom in France, crumbled under Beaufort's watch. The humiliation gnawed at him like a parasite. Contemporaries noted his hollow eyes and silent meals, the way he wandered the halls of court like a ghost. He had been entrusted with vast responsibility, and he returned with nothing but disgrace. By May of 1444, the shame consumed him. On the 27th of that month, he was found lifeless in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official story was fever. But in an England thick with suspicion, whispers told another tale: poison or his own hand. A nobleman undone by failure, choosing death rather than dishonor. For Margaret, who was barely a year old at the time, the loss of her father was not only personal, but political. His death left her vulnerable, her future uncertain, and her mother suddenly alone to safeguard both child and inheritance. The widow, Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, was no stranger to survival. She understood that in the ruthless game of noble politics, a girl without a father was a pawn waiting to be seized. She wasted no time in securing her daughter's path, weaving alliances that might shield the fragile Beaufort claim from annihilation. So Margaret's childhood unfolded in the stone-walled gardens of Bletsoe Castle, not with the laughter of games and dolls, but with the constant murmur of negotiation. Even as a small girl, she would have overheard her mother's conversations. Names of dukes, earls, and counts traded like cards, every match a potential lifeline or death sentence. While other children learned to sew or play, Margaret absorbed an education in survival. She was taught to read prayers in Latin, but also to understand that every friend could become a rival and every meal could carry poison. It was here, in the shadow of her father's disgrace and her mother's relentless scheming, that Margaret's character hardened. She was never truly a child. From the first, her life was bound to destiny. The same blood that made her a cousin to kings also painted a target on her back. And in England's unstable world of shifting allegiances, targets rarely survive for long. The irony was cruel but inescapable. The very thing that could one day raise Margaret to power, the blood of Lancaster, was also the curse that ensured her life would be lived under constant peril. It was this curse, etched into her veins, that led her toward the betrothals, the marriages, the widowhoods, and the endless sacrifices yet to come. For the child playing in the gardens of Bletsoe, the wheel of fortune had already turned. She just did not know it yet. In a world where women were bargaining chips and marriage's weapons sharper than any sword, Margaret's fate was decided almost before she could speak. At 6 years old, her small hand was promised in betrothal to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. To those around her, this was no tender promise of future love. It was a contract, parchment and ink, binding two powerful families together. The child bride-to-be scarcely understood what the vows meant. For her, the gardens of Bletsoe still held more allure than dynastic duty. Yet her life was already mortgaged to politics. The man who engineered this match, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, was among the most influential figures at King Henry VI's court. Ambitious, cunning, and trusted by the crown, he seemed an unshakable pillar of power. The betrothal to his son tethered young Margaret to a family at the height of favor. For a moment, her future appeared secure, a golden alliance promising safety and prestige. But politics is a tide that turns with terrifying speed. Within a handful of years, Suffolk's fortunes collapsed. His great crime in the eyes of England was negotiating Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and agreeing to surrender the provinces of Maine and Anjou to France. These concessions, seen as humiliations, ignited fury across England. Nobles snarled betrayal, commoners muttered treason, and Suffolk became the scapegoat for the bleeding wounds of the 100 Years' War. The fall was swift and merciless. In 1450, as Suffolk attempted to cross the Channel into exile, he was seized by pirates. Some whispered Yorkist agents, others said disgruntled enemies within the crown's own ranks. Dragged onto the deck, he was forced to kneel. The executioner's sword was dull, hacking clumsily at his neck. It took several strikes to sever his head, the sea spray mingling with blood as his corpse was cast into the waves. For Margaret, The death of Suffolk was the death of her betrothal. The parchment that had bound her future was now nothing but worthless ink. Overnight, she went from being allied with one of the realm's greatest houses to being once again a vulnerable heiress, her fate hanging in the balance. This was Margaret's first lesson in betrayal, not of the heart, but of the cruel instability of power. One day you are aligned with dukes, the next you are tainted by their disgrace. Her mother, the widowed Margaret Beauchamp, understood this truth well. If they were to survive, adaptability was not a choice but a necessity. So while other children her age played with toys carved from wood, Margaret was being shuffled between potential futures, her worth measured in estates, inheritances, and bloodlines. She was learning, though she may not yet have realized it, that survival meant silence, patience, and readiness to bend when the storm demanded it. This lesson would follow her all her life. Betrothal and betrayal, promise and collapse, these were the patterns into which her existence was woven. And it was only the beginning. By the time Margaret was 12, her fate had been sealed again. Her new husband was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a man in his 20s, seasoned in war and politics. He was no great lord of ancient lineage. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts, their legitimacy doubted, their nobility recently won through scandal and marriage. Yet they possessed something more precious than pedigree, the favor of King Henry VI. The Tudor line began with Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier whose charm and daring had caught the heart of Catherine of Valois, widow of the great Henry V. Their secret marriage had been a scandal whispered across England, a queen dowager, mother of a king, wed to a servant. Yet from this forbidden union came Edmund and his brother Jasper, whom Henry VI, half-brothers through Catherine, raised to noble rank. In a kingdom where legitimacy was fragile and ambition deadly, such royal favor was everything. Thus the union of Edmund and young Margaret was not a matter of affection, but of statecraft. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, where Margaret had spent her childhood. The hall was hung with tapestries recounting her Beaufort ancestors' deeds, as if the fated glory of her blood might sanctify the match. Guests murmured prayers, nobles exchanged calculating glances, and the bride, barely out of childhood, was bound by vows she could scarcely comprehend. Edmund Tudor was a man of experience. Margaret was still a girl growing into her body. Yet in the eyes of 15th century politics, her womb was not a child's, but an instrument of dynastic survival. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no concept of waiting, no mercy for her frailty. What happened on that wedding night, Margaret never recorded, but its shadow haunted her for life. Chroniclers note her lifelong obsession with religion, her retreat into prayer and austerity, signs of a soul scarred in youth. The evidence in her body told the rest, the injuries from that forced consummation, the damage that would render her fragile, almost broken, by the time she bore her only child. For Margaret, marriage was no sanctuary. It was another battlefield, one where her small frame bore the blows instead of armor. And yet, as she would again and again, she endured. She learned the truth of her age. Noble girls were not daughters, wives, or mothers in the way we think of them today. They were vessels, bound to the will of men, traded like coin. Still, even at 12, Margaret carried a sharpness of mind beyond her years. She understood that what seemed her undoing might yet be her weapon. Through Edmund, she was now tied directly to the Tudor brothers, men close to the crown, men with influence. It was a fragile connection, but one that would prove fateful. The child who had once played in Bletsoe's gardens was now a bride in a man's world, her girlhood stripped away in the name of politics. The vows had been spoken, the bed had been entered, and Margaret Beaufort's path had narrowed to a single purpose: to give England another heir, no matter the cost to her own life. Fate wasted no time in tightening its grip on Margaret. Barely a year into her marriage, Edmund Tudor was gone. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in South Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. He never left alive. The circumstances of his death were cloaked in the fog of war. Officially, it was plague, an explanation convenient for his captors. Disease was rife in medieval prisons, and plague absolved enemies of blame. Yet whispers said otherwise. Some claimed Edmund was murdered outright, a dangerous pawn too close to the throne. Others suggested betrayal from within his own ranks, a dagger in the dark rather than fever in the blood. Whatever the truth, his death left Margaret a widow at just 13 years old, her belly swelling with the child conceived in their brief, brutal marriage. It was a cruel transformation, from innocent girl to wife to widow and mother-to-be, all before she had even crossed the threshold of womanhood. In a kingdom where widows were often discarded or remarried in haste, Margaret's condition made her precarious. But Edmund's brother, Jasper Tudor, stepped into the void. Half-brother to the king, seasoned in war, Jasper was both pragmatic and protective. He recognized the fragile treasure Margaret carried within her, the unborn heir who might one day preserve their family's tenuous hold on power. So he took her under his wing. With winter closing in, he arranged for her to be moved to the fortress of Pembroke Castle in West Wales, where the thick stone walls and loyal garrison might shield her from both Yorkist swords and the judgmental whispers of court. The journey itself was an ordeal. The roads, churned to mud by autumn rains, froze solid under winter's bite. Margaret, heavily pregnant, traveled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt over the rutted tracks a lance of pain through her frail body. Servants cleared fallen branches, ferrymen guided them over icy rivers, and always there was fear of armed bands lurking in the woods, fear of accident, fear that the child inside her might not survive the journey. What should have been 2 days stretched into 5. By the time the towers of Pembroke loomed against the slate-gray sky, Margaret was exhausted, her body trembling with the strain. Pembroke Castle was a fortress of ancient power, perched on limestone cliffs above Milford Haven, its round keep rising nearly 80 feet, a stone sentinel against storm and siege alike. It had withstood centuries of war, but for Margaret it was not strength she saw. It was isolation. The Atlantic winds shrieked through every crack in the walls, carrying with them the salt of the sea and the sense that the world had narrowed to this cold, drafty stronghold at the edge of England. Within its walls, her life shrank to waiting for childbirth, waiting for war, waiting to see if God intended her survival. She was 13 years old, widowed, frightened, and carrying a child larger than her body was ever meant to bear. The future of the Tudor line rested inside her womb, and the cost of bringing it forth might be her life. The winter of 1456 into 1457 was one of the harshest in living memory. At Pembroke Castle, the stones themselves seemed to ache with cold. Ice formed on the inside of narrow windows, and the Atlantic wind moaned through arrow slits like the voices of ghosts. Fires blazed day and night, but the hearths devoured wood faster than Jasper Tudor's men could supply it. For Margaret, confined to her chambers, even the warmth of fur-lined blankets could not ease the chill or the gnawing dread within her. She was a child forced into a woman's prison, her own body the cruelest captor. Each day, the weight of her swelling belly grew heavier, pressing down on hips still too narrow, bones not yet ready for this burden. The castle's physician, Dr. Louis Caerleon, a man of Oxford and Paris learning, examined her with furrowed brow. He had attended noblewomen before, seen the dangers of childbirth, but here the danger was doubled. Margaret's frame was slight, her pelvis underdeveloped. The child within her seemed restless, its position wrong. He whispered his fears to Jasper. It may kill her, or both. Jasper Tudor was only in his 20s, yet already battle-tested and seasoned by politics. Still, the responsibility that now weighed upon him was heavier than any armor. His brother Edmund was dead, and in Margaret's womb lay the fragile continuation of their line. If she perished, if the child was lost, the Tudors might vanish back into obscurity, remembered only as the scandalous Welsh offspring of a queen dowager's secret marriage. He walked the cold battlements at night, the wind whipping in his cloak, replaying the physician's words over and over. Could he act? Could anyone intervene? Or was Margaret's fate already sealed? Inside, the girl herself found refuge where she could, in God. She spent hours in Pembroke's chapel, her knees pressed against the stone until they bled, her young lips shaping Latin prayers she barely understood but clung to with desperation. She read the Psalms with a fervor that startled her attendants, begging for mercy, begging for meaning. Historians would later remark that Margaret's lifelong piety, her obsession with devotion, fasting, pilgrimages, was forged here in this crucible of fear and isolation. Religion became not just comfort but armor, a way to impose sense upon suffering too great for a child to bear. She was not left entirely alone. Father Meredith, Pembroke's Welsh priest, guided her prayers, but also her mind. He had studied at Cambridge, a man of both books and battlefield realities. From him, Margaret learned that faith was not only ritual, but strategy, that God might work through action as much as through miracle. She absorbed his lessons, and alongside her prayers, she began to study. She asked questions about politics, about the tangled roots of the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims. She read what she could, listened when Jasper spoke of war councils. Though trapped in a chamber, she was shaping herself into something far more dangerous than a victim, a thinker. Her attendants noticed the change. The little girl who once sat quietly with embroidery now lingered over chronicles of saints and kings. She repeated prayers not with childish sing-song, but with the gravity of one who knew she might soon meet her maker. Her eyes, still youthful, had taken on a seriousness beyond her years. Still, the fear of childbirth was never far. The midwives, experienced women hardened by decades of births, watched her silently. They had seen girls like her before, too young, too small, and they knew what such labors often brought: blood, death, mourning. In private, they muttered to one another, exchanging looks of pity. They prepared herbs for pain, instruments for emergencies, and whispered the names of saints to call upon when the hour came. Margaret sensed their unease. She felt it in the quiet that fell when she entered a room, in the way hands lingered on her shoulders as if to reassure, in the sudden fervor of prayers when her name was mentioned. She understood enough. The road ahead was not simply hard, it was perilous. Yet she carried herself with a composure that unsettled even Jasper. She knew she might die, but she had already decided, if death came, it must come giving life. For within her, she carried not just a child but hope itself, the frail thread upon which her family's destiny, perhaps even Lancaster's cause, depended. As the year turned and the snow piled against Pembroke's walls, Margaret Beaufort, child of noble blood, widow of Edmund Tudor, prepared herself for the ordeal that would define her forever. The wind outside howled like a warning, but within her chamber, candles burned against the dark. The storm was coming, not only of war and politics, but of birth and blood and survival. January 1457. The night that would sear itself into history began not with triumph, but with terror. Margaret Beaufort, barely 13 years old, was walking slowly along Pembroke's inner battlements, urged by the physician to take gentle exercise, when the first wave of pain struck. It was like being cleaved in two. She collapsed against the cold stone, gasping as her attendants rushed to her side. By the time they carried her back to her chamber, the contractions were coming in relentless succession. The birthing room became a theater of agony. Midwives bustled in with steaming basins, cloths, herbs, lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, pungent roots for fortitude. They whispered to one another with grim eyes. Too small, too soon, too dangerous. Margaret's screams rose and fell like a tide, reverberating through the corridors, reaching Jasper Tudor pacing beyond the heavy door. He stopped with every cry, fists clenched, helpless as steel. Hours stretched into a night that seemed eternal. 18 hours of agony, each moment a contest between life and death. Margaret's thin frame writhed beneath bloodied sheets, her voice breaking until only raw gasps emerged. Dame Gwen Furch-Daffyd, the head midwife with 30 years of experience, commanded the room like a battlefield general. She tried every tactic she knew, repositioning the girl, massaging, chanting prayers passed down from generations of women who had fought this same battle. Still, the child would not come. The physician, Dr. Lewis Caerleon, stood by, grave and restless. He knew too well the dangers. A cesarean could be attempted, but it would almost certainly kill Margaret. To wait longer might kill both. The choice was a knife's edge, and it was not his alone to make. He exchanged dark whispers with Dame Gwen, their words drowned by the young mother's cries. Outside, Jasper Tudor knelt in the castle chapel, his head bowed to the altar. For him, the stakes were unbearable. Edmund was gone, Lancaster faltering, England tearing itself apart in civil war. If Margaret died, so too might the Tudor line. If the child was lost, then all of Edmund's legacy, and perhaps Lancaster's last hope, would vanish into the grave with her. Jasper prayed with a desperation that was less piety than bargaining. In the chamber, time collapsed into pain. The midwives prepared knives and hooks, instruments rarely spoken of, meant for the unspeakable. Candles guttered in their sconces, shadows stretching across blood-streaked walls. Margaret, her face ashen, whispered prayers between contractions, calling on the Virgin Mary, on Saint Margaret of Antioch, on every saint whose name she knew. Her attendants feared they were watching a child slip into death. Then in a moment so fragile it seemed spun of glass, Dame Gwen made a final attempt, guiding, turning, coaxing with every ounce of skill and courage she had, and with a cry torn as much from the earth as from Margaret's body, the infant slid into the world. For one heartbeat, there was silence, unbearable silence. The child lay limp, pale, slick with blood. The midwives froze, eyes wide with dread. Dame Gwen bent quickly, clearing the infant's throat, pressing its chest, whispering fiercely in Welsh as if to command the child to live. And then, sound, thin, sharp, defiant, a newborn's cry. Relief washed over the room. Henry Tudor, the boy who would one day become Henry VII of England, had taken his first breath. Margaret, barely conscious, turned her head weakly. Through the haze of exhaustion, she saw him, a blur swaddled in linen, his cries sharp in the smoke-thick air. She reached, her arm trembling, but her strength failed. Dame Gwen laid the infant against her chest for the briefest of moments, enough for a mother's eyes to memorize her son's face. Then the midwives pulled him back to the firelight, swaddling him tightly, ensuring his fragile body was warmed. But the cost was devastating. Margaret's body was torn, her insides ravaged beyond healing. Dr. Caroleon examined her days later and whispered the truth to Jasper Tudor. She would never bear another child. At 13, her womb was closed forever. This single, violent labor had ended her fertility before her womanhood had even begun. Yet she had done what was asked. She had given England an heir at the price of her body, her innocence, and almost her life. Outside the walls of Pembroke, storms battered the cliffs, waves shattered against stone. Inside, a dynasty had been born in blood, pain, and defiance. Margaret Beaufort, the child who became a mother that night, had survived. Barely. But from her agony, the Tudor rose would one day bloom. When dawn finally crept across the gray Welsh sky, Margaret Beaufort was alive, but only just. Her small body lay shattered, her face drained of color, lips cracked, eyes sunken into hollows. Fever swept over her in the days that followed, alternating chills and burning heat. The chamber reeked of blood, sweat, and vinegar as attendants scrubbed the stone floor. But no cleansing could erase the memory of what had happened there. For weeks she hovered between life and death. Dr. Lewis Caerleon did all he could, bleeding her to balance the humors, administering bitter herbal tonics steeped in wine, spooning broth into her parched mouth. Dame Gwen sat constantly at her bedside, her weathered hands stroking Margaret's hair, whispering prayers and lullabies half meant for the girl, half for the child she had nearly lost. The midwives, who had seen too many mothers buried after childbirth, spoke of her survival as miracle. But miracles leave scars. The tearing was so severe, the damage so great, that Margaret's body would never recover fully. She was told in careful whispers what she already felt in her bones. She would never again bear children. At 13 years old, she had fulfilled her reproductive destiny in a single act of violence against her body. The Tudors had their heir, but at the cost of Margaret's womb. The psychological wounds were more invisible, yet no less profound. In the weeks after the birth, Margaret often woke screaming in the night, the echoes of her own cries still trapped in her mind. She recoiled from touch, even the gentle hands of her attendants. Some nights she sat silently by the fire, rocking herself as the baby's cries stirred memories of her agony. To hold him was to relive her pain, yet to let him go was unthinkable. Her love for Henry was fierce but complicated, tangled with the trauma of his arrival. Still, as her strength returned, so too did her resolve. Even through the haze of fever, she understood what others around her whispered. This child was no ordinary infant. He was the living thread of Lancaster's hope, the last fragile seed from which their cause might grow. In her son's survival, Margaret saw not only her purpose but her armor. Whatever suffering she had endured, it could not be in vain. Beyond Pembroke's walls, England was already tearing itself apart. 2 years earlier, in 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans had erupted, marking the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. The White Rose of York had drawn blood from the Red Rose of Lancaster, and the realm would never be the same. The weak, pious King Henry VI wavered on his throne, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in madness. His French queen, Margaret of Anjou, fought ruthlessly to preserve Lancastrian power, but her foreign birth and ambition made her despised. The nobility sharpened their daggers, the kingdom slid into civil war. Margaret Beaufort, still little more than a girl, could not yet have known the scale of storms to come. But she sensed instinctively that her son was more than her child. He was a symbol, a claim, a destiny that others would kill to possess or to destroy. As she lay in her bed at Pembroke, staring at the stone ceiling through fevered eyes, she made a silent vow. She would not let him be lost. Her body might have been broken, but her will was unyielding. Out of agony was forged something harder than steel, an iron determination that would guide her through decades of betrayal, loss, and shifting allegiances. She had given England its heir. Now she would dedicate her life to ensuring that Henry Tudor lived long enough to claim what was his. The girl who had nearly died in childbirth was beginning her transformation. The pain had stripped away her childhood. In its place stood a mother with a singular, relentless purpose. Margaret's recovery was slow, but the world did not wait for her. In 15th century England, widows were vulnerable pawns, and young widows with valuable bloodlines were irresistible to ambitious families. Edmund Tudor was gone, but his brother Jasper still shielded Margaret and the infant Henry. Yet Jasper could not guard her forever. Protection in those days often meant remarriage. By 1458, scarcely a year after surviving the ordeal at Pembroke, Margaret was wed again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. The marriage was no grand spectacle, no tapestry-draped ceremony like her wedding to Edmund. It was quieter, more practical, as if all involved understood that the union was about survival, not celebration. Stafford was a very different man from Edmund. Where Edmund had been an ambitious soldier, Stafford was a pragmatist, a man who valued stability above glory. His family leaned toward the Yorkist side, which at first seemed a bitter irony. Margaret, who carried Lancastrian blood in her veins, was bound to a household sympathetic to her family's rivals. But this paradox also offered her a shield. With Stafford, she gained protection from suspicion, a buffer against the chaos of war. For Margaret, the match was less about passion than protection. She was barely 15, still weakened by childbirth, still haunted by trauma. Stafford offered her something Edmund never had: time to breathe. Though he was no tender lover, he was not cruel. Their union was more business arrangement than romance. But in those years of turbulence, pragmatism could feel like mercy. Most importantly, the marriage contract had been carefully crafted. Margaret retained control of her Beaufort estates, rare for a woman of her age. This meant her son's inheritance, fragile though it was, remained safeguarded. Stafford, in return, offered military strength and political cover. He knew her value and she knew his, and between them a wary respect grew. Henry, her son, did not live under her roof. He remained in the care of Jasper Tudor, tucked safely away in Wales. Margaret saw him rarely, perhaps once or twice a year. Each reunion was a bittersweet moment. Her arms longed to hold him, but distance and politics kept them apart. She poured her longing into letters, sending him small gifts, tokens of love wrapped in caution. It was an unnatural motherhood, yet it was all the times allowed. While separated from her son, Margaret turned her sharp mind to other pursuits. Managing estates was no small task in a land fractured by war. She learned to read accounts, balance ledgers, negotiate with tenants. She studied law and the intricacies of noble rights. She discovered that knowledge of finances, of law, of politics, was power, and she was determined to wield it. Through Stafford's connections, she also found herself exposed to both Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. She observed closely, listened carefully. She noted how easily men betrayed one another, how quickly fortunes changed. It was an education more valuable than any tutor's lesson. How to survive in a world where loyalties shifted like sand. For now, Margaret had carved out a fragile stability. She was wife to a Yorkist sympathizer, mother of a Lancastrian heir, mistress of her estates. The Wars of the Roses raged on beyond her walls, but within them, she prepared quietly, patiently, for the time when she would need to fight not with swords, but with strategy. She was still a teenager, yet already Margaret Beaufort was becoming the calculating woman. The years that followed were a study in longing. Margaret Beaufort was Henry's mother, yet not his caretaker. Her son, her only child, the sole legacy of her broken body, remained under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor in Wales. For Margaret, this separation was both salvation and torment. It kept Henry safe, but it tore her heart apart. She saw him rarely, and only under carefully arranged conditions. A few days here, a stolen week there, always overshadowed by politics, always under the watchful eyes of others. When she did see him, she would stare with a quiet intensity, as if memorizing every line of his face to carry with her through the long absences. He grew from swaddled infant into a boy with quick eyes and a steady gaze. But to Margaret, each reunion felt like meeting a stranger who happened also to be her son. Unable to mother him daily, she mothered him from afar. She sent letters, written with the careful formality of the age but laced with personal tenderness. She sent gifts, small books, clothes, devotional items, tokens to remind him he was never forgotten. Sometimes the messages were coded, disguised within mundane reports of estate affairs, so they could slip unnoticed through the shifting currents of war. This distance carved a wound in Margaret that never truly healed. It was not indifference that kept them apart, but necessity. In a kingdom where children of royal blood could vanish overnight, blood in towers, poisoned in cups, dispatched in the name of political convenience, separation was a form of protection. Margaret lived with the bitter knowledge that the best way to keep her son alive was to keep him far from her. Yet she refused to let absence weaken her bond. If she could not give him warmth in childhood, she would give him a purpose. She poured her ambition into him, seeing in Henry not just a boy, but a destiny. From her own studies, she encouraged his education. Under Jasper's care, Henry learned more than courtly manners. He learned Welsh, the rhythms of rural life, the loyalty of men who respected not bloodlines, but character. These lessons in exile would shape the king he would one day become. Meanwhile, Margaret's own education deepened. With Stafford's protection, she managed her estates, studying law and accounts with the focus of a scholar. She learned the value of patience, of watching the tides of war without throwing herself into their waves. The Wars of the Roses continued to churn, battles won, thrones seized, kings toppled. Yet Margaret endured, sharpening her mind in the shadows. Still at night, when the halls grew quiet, she would kneel before the crucifix, praying for Henry's safety. Her piety grew into obsession. Attendants whispered that she prayed until her knees bled, that she fasted beyond reason, that her devotions bordered on severity. Perhaps it was guilt, the guilt of a mother absent from her child. Perhaps it was strategy, seeking divine favor for the fragile thread of life that bound Henry to England's future. Or perhaps it was her way of finding meaning in a life that had forced her to sacrifice everything but hope. Margaret's motherhood was unlike any other. She was not the woman who kissed scraped knees or guided a child's hand in writing. She was the mother who plotted, prayed, and preserved from a distance, who carried her son not in her arms but in her will. And in that quiet determination, Henry's destiny was already being forged. The fragile peace of Margaret's second marriage unfolded under the thunder of war. England itself had become a battlefield, torn between the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. Margaret's blood bound her to the Lancastrians, yet her husband Henry Stafford leaned toward York. It was a paradox that placed her in constant danger and also gave her cover. The wars were not distant. They arrived on muddy fields where tens of thousands fought and died, their corpses left for crows. The most dreadful of these early clashes was the Battle of Towton in March 1461, a Palm Sunday turned bloodbath. Snow whipped across the Yorkshire plain, as perhaps 50,000 men clashed in the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. By day's end, nearly half were slain. The rivers ran red, and the fields were piled with frozen corpses. Out of this carnage rose Edward IV, the young, charismatic Yorkist who seized the crown from the faltering Henry VI. For Margaret, the victory of York was a dagger to the heart. She knew that her son Henry, still a boy in Jasper Tudor's care, would now be seen as a threat, however distant his claim. Edward IV had already shown he would not hesitate to strike down Lancastrian heirs. At night, Margaret lay awake, imagining soldiers storming Jasper's castles. Henry dragged away, his life ended before it had truly begun. Her answer was vigilance. Margaret began building an intelligence network, small at first. Servants who listened, merchants who carried whispers, clerks who copied royal correspondence. She paid in coin, in favors, in promises. Information became her weapon. If armies were swords, then news was the edge she would wield. She sought to know before others did. Troop movements, shifting loyalties, rumors of Yorkist purges. Her life, and Henry's, depended on it. Meanwhile, Henry Stafford served Edward IV faithfully. He fought under the Yorkist banner, proving his loyalty in battle. In 1469, at the Battle of Edgecote, Stafford was wounded grievously, a gash to the thigh that festered with infection. Margaret nursed him through fever and pain, tending him with a devotion that surprised many. But as Stafford lay weakened, bitterness crept into his heart. He had fought for Edward, risked his life, and yet saw little reward for his service. Margaret seized the moment. She never spoke openly of treason. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, she planted seeds. She spoke gently of Lancaster's lost glories, of Edward's arrogance, of corruption festering under Yorkist rule. She appealed not to politics, but to pride. Stafford, already embittered, began to question his loyalties. It was a delicate dance. Margaret had to move carefully, for one wrong word could bring charges of treason crashing down on her. But she had learned by now how to move unseen, how to bend conversation like a reed in the wind. Slowly, patiently, she began to turn her husband's sympathies. While she maneuvered in shadows, her son Henry grew. Under Jasper's watchful eye in Wales, the boy was learning more than knightly skills. He absorbed the rhythm of Welsh speech, the loyalty of men hardened by frontier life. He learned how to live simply, how to command respect not through title but through character. He was growing into a youth who, though exiled from court, was becoming quietly formidable. Yet Margaret never felt secure. The wheel of fortune in England spun too quickly. Edward IV was king, but Lancaster was not yet dead. Margaret of Anjou, the fierce queen of Henry VI, plotted tirelessly from exile. Armies gathered, disbanded, rose again. Margaret Beaufort, still in her 20s, had already endured more loss and fear than most would face in a lifetime. Yet she endured, her mind sharpening, her resolve hardening. She was learning the most important lesson of survival in the Wars of the Roses. Kingdoms could fall in a day, but those who outlasted, those who endured with patience and cunning, would inherit the crown. The wheel of fortune, always turning, swung again in 1470. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker himself, turned against the very monarch he had raised up. Edward IV, once his protege, had grown too independent, too headstrong, and Warwick's pride could not bear it. In a stunning twist, Warwick allied with Margaret of Anjou, queen of the deposed Henry VI. The Yorkist king was driven into exile, and in a haze of triumph and disbelief, the feeble Henry VI was restored to the throne. For Margaret Beaufort, it seemed a miracle. For a moment, the Lancastrian rose bloomed again. The streets of London thronged with loyalists, church bells rang, and the mad king was led out of the tower, bewildered but crowned once more. Margaret herself witnessed the restoration, her heart lifting with cautious hope. Could it be that her son, Henry Tudor, tucked away in Wales under Jasper's protection, might now be seen as a beacon for the Lancastrian cause? But Margaret had lived long enough to distrust miracles, and she was right. The triumph was short-lived. Edward IV returned from Burgundy in 1471, bringing with him hardened mercenaries and the support of nobles weary of chaos. 2 battles decided everything. At Barnet, Warwick the kingmaker fell, his body trampled in the mud. Weeks later at Tewkesbury, Lancaster's last hopes were crushed. Edward, Prince of Wales, the only son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was slain, some said in battle, others whispered in cold blood after capture. Days later, Henry VI himself died mysteriously in the Tower, almost certainly murdered on Edward IV's orders. In a single season, the direct Lancastrian line was extinguished, and in that vacuum, eyes turned toward Margaret's son. Henry Tudor, still a boy, became the last Lancastrian of consequence. His claim was distant, tangled through the Beaufort line, shadowed by questions of legitimacy. But he was young, male, and alive, and in the brutal logic of dynastic war, that made him dangerous. Margaret felt the change instantly, like a shift in the air before a storm. Her child, once a fragile treasure hidden in Wales, was now a target. Edward IV had proven his willingness to strike down heirs. Would he extend that ruthlessness to her son? She lived in constant dread of news, an ambush, an arrest, a body lying lifeless in a castle yard. Jasper Tudor understood the peril as well. He tightened Henry's security, shuffling him from fortress to fortress, keeping his whereabouts secret. It was a perilous existence filled with sudden journeys by night, hushed commands, locked gates. Henry grew up in shadows, his boyhood stolen by danger. For Margaret, every rumor was a knife. She redoubled her networks of informants, bribing servants, paying merchants, even bending priests to her cause. Information became her lifeline, the only assurance that her son still lived. In the quiet hours, she prayed harder than ever, her knees pressed into the cold flagstones until they bled. Yet she was no passive supplicant. She was learning to weave strands of influence across a fractured kingdom, preparing for a future she could scarcely name aloud. Her son, one day, upon the throne. But for now, the world had shifted against her again. Edward IV sat securely on his crown, Yorkist banners flying high, while Margaret's fragile hope was forced back into silence. The dream of Lancaster seemed dead. Still, Margaret Beaufort did not break. She never broke. If anything, each reversal hardened her resolve. She knew now that patience would be her weapon, silence her shield. The wars of the Roses had consumed kings, princes, and great lords, but she would endure. And one day when the tide turned again, she would be ready. The crushing defeat at Tewkesbury in 1471 marked not only the death of Prince Edward and Henry VI, it marked the end of Lancastrian leadership. What remained was scattered, hunted, or in hiding. In that void, the fragile hope of Lancaster narrowed to one boy, Margaret's son, Henry Tudor. At 14, Henry was hardly more than a youth, but in him, bloodlines converged. Through his mother, he carried the Beaufort claim, a threadbare but legitimate link to John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. And because every stronger branch of Lancaster had been chopped down, Henry, against all odds, now stood as the last living standard-bearer. But a boy with a claim was a boy in danger. Edward IV had little mercy for rivals, no matter how distant. Jasper Tudor, Henry's uncle and guardian, saw the peril with terrifying clarity. To remain in Wales was to wait for a knock at the castle gate, for Yorkist soldiers to drag Henry away to the Tower. Or worse. So Jasper made a desperate choice: flight. In the late summer of 1471, as Yorkist forces tightened their grip, he spirited Henry from Pembroke to the coast. They reached Tenby under cover of darkness, a town perched precariously against the restless sea. There, as rumors swirled of Yorkist patrols closing in, Henry was hurried aboard a small ship bound for Brittany. The sea wind tore its sails and cloaks alike as the vessel lurched into the waves, carrying the last Lancastrian hope away from his homeland. For Henry, exile meant an adolescence of uncertainty. In Brittany, under the wary protection of Duke Francis II, he lived as both guest and prisoner. He was valuable, a bargaining chip that could be sold to the highest bidder, England, France, or Burgundy. His life hung on the whims of foreign rulers who might at any moment deliver him into Yorkist hands. He was kept under close watch, shifted between castles, never fully trusted, never fully free. For Margaret, the news of her son's flight was both a relief and a devastation. Relief because exile meant safety from immediate execution. Devastation because the sea now divided them. She had endured years of separation, seeing him rarely, but at least he had been within the same kingdom. Now he was beyond her treed in foreign lands, where her letters could barely follow, where whispers of his fate came weeks or months late, if they came at all. When she finally learned he was across the channel, her heart broke anew. She would not see him again for 14 years. It was in this moment of despair that Margaret's resolve transformed into something unshakable. She was not merely Henry's mother now, she became his strategist, his advocate, his anchor. Every move she made, every alliance she considered, every prayer she whispered was bent toward one purpose: to preserve her son until the moment he could return. Meanwhile, fate carved another sharp turn. In 1471, Margaret's husband, Henry Stafford, succumbed to illness, or perhaps to the lingering effects of his old battle wound. His death left Margaret a widow once more, not yet 30 years old and twice bereaved. To some, widowhood meant weakness. To Margaret, it meant freedom. No longer tethered to a Yorkist household, she could maneuver more boldly. Yet the danger was immense. Edward IV's reign was strong, his enemies crushed. Margaret was a Lancastrian mother with a Lancastrian son in exile, an identity that could, at any moment, be her death warrant. So she cloaked herself in patience. Outwardly, she lived quietly, the pious widow devoted to her lands and prayers. Inwardly, she sharpened her mind and strengthened her networks, planning for a day no one else yet believed would come. The world thought the red rose had withered, crushed beneath the white. But Margaret Beaufort, alone in her widow's black, did not believe in death for causes. She believed in endurance. She believed in waiting. And she believed, above all, in her son. Henry Tudor had left England as a hunted boy. Margaret vowed he would return as a king. By the early 1470s, Margaret Beaufort was a woman marked by loss, yet steeled by survival. She had been a child bride, a widow, a mother broken by childbirth, and once more a widow. Twice she had buried husbands. Her son, the last fragile hope of Lancaster, languished across the channel in uneasy exile. To many, she might have seemed a spent figure. But Margaret had learned the deepest truth of survival in England's wars. Alliances were weapons, and she was about to forge her most powerful one. Her third marriage was to Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most enigmatic and calculating men in the realm. Stanley was no ordinary noble. He was a political survivor par excellence, a man who could bend with every wind, shift sides at the last moment, and always emerge on the winning side. His family commanded vast influence in the Northwest, his retinues numbering in the thousands. He was feared, respected, distrusted, but never ignored. For Margaret, marriage to Stanley was not born of affection. It was a deliberate act of strategy. She brought to the union the prestige of Beaufort blood and the claim embodied in her son, Henry. Stanley offered military strength, political protection, and, perhaps most important, cover. As his wife, she could mask her Lancastrian loyalties beneath his flexible allegiances. Together they would form a partnership of convenience, each using the other as shield and sword. The wedding was no hushed affair. By design, it was a spectacle. Tournaments, banquets, days of feasting announced to England that Margaret Beaufort was not fading into obscurity. She was still a force to be reckoned with, still tied by blood to the House of Lancaster, still dangerous. Edward IV himself attended the celebrations, a gesture both of recognition and of calculation. Better to keep the formidable Margaret close, under watchful eyes, than allow her to weave plots unseen. Within this new marriage, Margaret thrived. Stanley did not love her in the way poets describe, but he respected her mind and perhaps admired her resilience. He gave her space to manage her estates and, crucially, to pursue her cause discreetly. Margaret, in turn, lent him legitimacy and links to Lancastrian sympathizers. Together, they built an alliance of cold pragmatism, but one that would prove decisive when the final reckoning came. Meanwhile, across the sea in Brittany, Henry Tudor grew into manhood under the precarious guardianship of Duke Francis II. He was valuable, too valuable to trust fully, and so he was shifted like a chess piece between castles, sometimes welcomed as honored guest, sometimes watched as potential hostage. Margaret lived in perpetual torment, uncertain of his fate from month to month. Letters passed between them in elaborate codes, disguised as mundane correspondence, hidden in the margins of trade documents or beneath layers of invisible ink. Merchants, pilgrims, and clerks became her messengers, carrying fragments of hope across dangerous waters. This was Margaret at her most formidable, a widow turned wife, a mother turned conspirator, a woman weaving a web of intelligence and alliances across England and the continent. She cultivated ties not only with Lancastrian exiles, but also with Yorkist courtiers, playing the long game of loyalty, always ready to shift when the tide turned. She presented herself as a devout matron, cloaked in prayer and piety. But beneath the veil, she was a strategist sharper than steel. She lived with a constant fear that one day word would come of Henry's death, by assassin's blade, by shipwreck, by illness in some foreign castle. That fear might have broken another woman. For Margaret, it became fuel. She prayed harder, plotted deeper, listened more carefully. Her son was alive, and so long as he lived, she would not stop. The marriage to Thomas Stanley gave Margaret the one thing she had lacked, security to maneuver openly. And when the crown of England trembled once more, when Edward IV died and Richard of Gloucester seized the throne, it would be the Stanley's soldiers and Margaret's unyielding will that would decide the fate of England. The stage was set. The storm that had been building for decades was about to break. In April 1483, fate jolted England yet again. Edward IV, still in his prime, died suddenly at 40. His heir, a boy of 12, was proclaimed Edward I, but a child king in a kingdom of wolves was a lamb on the altar. Within weeks, Edward's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized control. The boy and his younger brother were taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly to await the coronation. They were never seen again. The whispers spread like wildfire. Richard had murdered the princes. Whether by dagger, smothering pillow, or poison, few doubted their fate. Richard crowned himself Richard III, but his reign was poisoned from birth. His legitimacy was stained with blood. To many across England, the disappearance of the boys was intolerable. It was not only a crime, it was a curse on Yorkist rule. For Margaret Beaufort, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The crown, though still far from her son's grasp, now looked vulnerable. With Yorkist legitimacy destroyed, Henry Tudor, distant though his claim might be, appeared a viable alternative. She moved with breathtaking audacity. Through Bishop John Morton and other allies, she began to weave together conspiracies, uniting discontented nobles, exiled Lancastrians, and even disillusioned Yorkists under one banner. Henry. The first attempt came in 1483 with Buckingham's rebellion. Margaret orchestrated it from the shadows, coordinating uprisings across the kingdom while Henry prepared to sail from Brittany. The rebellion faltered, storms scattered Henry's fleet, and the uprising collapsed. Richard's vengeance was swift. Rebels were executed. Margaret herself narrowly escaped death, saved only by her husband's influence. Richard placed her under house arrest, stripped her estates, and bound her under watchful eyes. Yet Margaret was not broken. Even confined, she plotted. Coded letters slipped through servants' hands. Plans were drawn in whispers and prayers. She thought not only of rebellion, but of the reign to come. How Henry must marry Elizabeth of York, uniting Lancaster and York in one crown, ending decades of bloodshed. It was not enough to seize the throne. He must heal the realm. Margaret envisioned it all, a dynasty born of her suffering and her son's endurance. 2 years later, in 1485, the moment came. Henry sailed from France with a small but determined army, landing at Milford Haven, the same coast where he had been born in blood and peril nearly 3 decades before. His march through Wales gathered men to his banner, the red dragon of Cadwallader flying proudly, invoking ancient Welsh prophecy. At Bosworth Field, on August 27, 1485, the storm finally broke. Richard III, armored in steel, led his forces with ferocity. Henry, untested in battle, placed his fate in the hands of his allies and in the timing of the Stanleys. For Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, had played his hand with exquisite care, holding his troops aloof until the decisive moment. Then, in a turn that would echo through history, the Stanleys charged against Richard. Betrayed, surrounded, the last Plantagenet king was cut down in the mud. His crown was seized and, in a moment heavy with destiny, placed on Henry Tudor's head. Margaret's son was king. The Wars of the Roses, a conflict that had torn England apart for 3 decades, ended not with treaties, but with the iron will of a mother and the survival of her child. Margaret Beaufort, once a girl screaming in agony on a cold winter night at Pembroke, now stood as the king's mother, the most powerful woman in England. Her work did not end there. She guided Henry as he forged the Tudor dynasty, counseled him in matters of state, and saw him wed Elizabeth of York, binding the warring roses into one crown. She became the matriarch of a new era, shaping policy, education, even the church. Her influence was everywhere, though she never sought the throne herself. She had always known her destiny lay not in wearing a crown, but in giving England the man who did. In 1509, Margaret Beaufort died just days after seeing her grandson crowned Henry VIII. She had lived long enough to witness the fruit of her suffering, a dynasty secure, a crown transformed, and England reshaped. In Westminster Abbey, her tomb of black marble still bears her Latin epitaph. But stone cannot capture the truth of her life. The girl who nearly died at 13 to bring forth a son had endured betrayal, exile, war, and loss. She had turned maternal love into political strategy, her faith into unbreakable will. The last echoes of her scream at Pembroke Castle in 1457 carried through decades of blood and fire until they crowned a king and ended a war. That scream of a girl who should have been a child, but instead became the mother of a dynasty, still lingers, if you listen closely, in the stones of Pembroke, in the winds of Bosworth, in the whispers of history itself.